Welcome everyone to our Fireside Chat. Today's topic is creating great urban places. Our Fireside Chats is an ongoing forum where we bring thoughtful, industry-leading professionals together to help us understand how we can optimize our experiences within our natural and built environment. Our last chat, we discussed the concept of healing spaces with Dr. Esther Sternberg, and we learned from her how the environment can greatly influence our health, well-being, and performance. Today, we'll learn from our panelists how they create great urban experiences that are active, safe, and inclusive for all. Now, just a little bit of webinar logistics before we get started. And also, I forgot to mention my name. My name is Jason Georgiorian. I'll be your moderator today. But a little bit of webinar logistics. Everyone's muted. If you're probably familiar with that, if you've been on our Fireside Chats in the past, but there's a Q&A button. It should be at the bottom of your screen. Please ask a question anytime during this chat. We'll do our best to roll those in as we go, and we want to get everyone's answers. In addition, we are recording this chat. If you registered, you'll be on the lookout for an email from us next week, and you'll see a link to this recording as well as a link to our past recordings. So please let us know what you think. You can reach us on our social media outlets by email or contact us on our website. And now I have the honor of introducing our two panelists. First, we have Tara Green. Tara is a principal of program development at OJB Landscape Architecture. She is accomplished in park programming, park management, community relations, strategic planning, public relations, and fundraising. She is committed to creating coalitions of support with diverse stakeholders and community groups, and excels at partnership development. Now, Tara led the team that transformed Clyde Warren Park in Dallas to a top destination. And during her tenure, Clyde Warren Park won 39 national and international awards, including the prestigious Urban Land Institute Urban Open Space Award in 2014. Welcome, Tara. Glad that you're with us and joining on our Fireside Chat today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Great to have you. Now, Dr. Bruce Race. Bruce is a professor at the Geraldine Hines School of Architecture and Design and director of University of Houston's Center for Sustainability and Resilience. He is also one of the very few architecture and urban planning professionals in the United States that have been elected to fellowship by both the American Institute of Architects and the American Institute of Certified Planners. He is the principal and founder of Race Studio and responsible for all aspects of project planning, design, and delivery. Since founding Race Studio, his projects have received 33 design and planning awards, including 9 national awards. Bruce is also a longtime friend of LGA and a former panelist on our Fireside Chat. So welcome back, Bruce.
Hey, great to be here.
Great. Now, without further ado, Craig, if you want to kick us off.
Great, thanks. Well, I'm hoping we can keep this very conversational. You guys are not only colleagues, but have been friends for a very long time. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to kind of interview through the course of this. But why don't we just start out? I mean, why are great urban experiences important to our cities? And maybe we'll start with Tara and then move to Bruce. And so guys, please go ahead and add on each other and talk over each other. Let's keep this going good.
Here, I'll throw out the big question first, huh? Get it rolling. That is a really great question. I think there are so many facets to this. And I'll tell you, the lens through which I'm going to answer all of my questions is from practical experience, having been a park operator, not a designer, not a sustainability expert, not anything with the science behind my rationale, but the practical experience of having run a public open space and having built a business model to run that space that was a little different than usual. And so my background for 25 years was in the sports industry. And I look at great open spaces and great public spaces as a way that people can have shared experiences, a way to bring community together to create memories. I look at it as a tremendous asset and value that simply creates community. I don't think you can have community without spaces where we can get together to do things on a scheduled basis or spontaneously, to have recreation, to have passive and active experiences together. And I never in my wildest dreams imagined I would be so immersed in this idea of community and open space and how we use green and nature. When I started out, in my early days with sports events but what I've come to appreciate is that there is a common denominator across all industries, and that's people needing to interact with one another, people wanting to interact with one another, and then also driving additional incremental value to your project, whatever that may be. And I believe that open space, public space, plazas, parks are the ways to which we can do that. They are kind of foundational to what we do as a community. And I think that was a really long answer, but that was a big question.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, part of it is that armature that cities have that create those experiences. So the open space system, some cities, even the indoor public spaces end up being part of that. I got my PhD in Cardiff. They have 7 really wonderful Victorian retail arcades that really end up being a very important part of the signature of the city when you start to think of it from that perspective. When you think of a city, you think of places. And with my students, and when I work through community workshops, we talk about space, activity, and path. Those are the most fundamental ingredients for placemaking. You have to shape a space, you have to activate it, and you have to certain way you experience it. Is it 250 feet a minute as a pedestrian? Is it 35 miles an hour in a car? And these are these modes and pace in which we experience cities. And like Tara, when I look at a city, the design starts with the program, right? So so you really have to think about what the intent is, and in some cases, the intent is to promote and allow the informal, right? So that's a big part of it. So Tara's public spaces are very flexible spaces. They allow a lot of different kinds of activities, but they also provide that social and cultural gravity we need in cities to give them our identity and our own identity, in terms of cities. I know tonight we'll talk about how to create public realms that are inclusive. And it's going to be a different discussion because there's before COVID, during COVID, and whatever's next. So how we think about cities now, and because there's how did Richard Florida put it? Where there's the fear of mingling, or so there's something along those lines. So we've gone through this collective shock, and how we start to think about how we get the most the spaces we have, and how we, in many respects, lean on them to provide that identity and contact that we really crave in cities. Now, the life of a city, I don't know about you, Tara, I don't know how many urban design plans I've read in the last 10 years that talk about live, work, play, right? And what has the pandemic done to that in terms of we think about our public open spaces and our experience? Because that's collapsed, right? So in many respects, the houses work, our cities have had to take over the work functions in many respects. And our competitiveness, so from an economic development standpoint, it's a new day. What Tara does, creating great spaces in urban centers, that's what the talent's looking for. And so we're recruiting talent instead of businesses. And so this is one of these other key dimensions when we think about design starting with the program. We can talk about the delight of cities that we've experienced, and everybody has favorite places, right? I do that with my students. We do cognitive mapping. Map your favorite place and tell me 3 reasons why. Just get the discussion going. And so tonight, thinking about what inclusiveness means before, during, and after the pandemic, I think it really has an interesting spin. to this broader objective.
Well, why don't we stay on that question? Because we'll come back to some other things too. But Tara, I know that you do a lot of work around making people feel welcomed, feel included in different public spaces. And how do you balance that, the equity of a public space with the safety of a public space?
So our approach is really, and Bruce said it, he said it very well, it's a balance. It's how do you create active and passive uses in your design? How do you give flexibility? So in our spaces, we're always thinking about that flexibility. We never want it to feel too overstimulated or too passive where there's no reason to cause you to linger longer. We want to give you surprise and delight when you come to the space, and you might not realize that you could participate in a free activity, a yoga class, a book club, whatever it may be, an arts and crafts exercise with your children, or you're scheduling a time to come there because you're intentional about coming to this activity, but you're going to linger afterwards because you simply just want to relax or hang out with your friends or your family while you're there. So creating spaces that are inclusive and welcoming and safe, I think go hand in hand, because one of those natural outputs of activating a space is safety. Good people doing good things deters bad actors, whatever that bad actor means. And so when you have foot traffic, when you have a natural rhythm to a space, a coming and going, you have activities that are going on in different areas, whether they be scheduled or spontaneous. You're creating this energy in this space that really deters those who want to do bad things from coming and setting up shop or taking root in that space. I also think it's an approach in how you train the park personnel that are working, whether they be rangers or staff or whatever the model is that's running that space. And what I always like to say is you want to be welcoming. The first approach should always be as a welcome, as opposed to a finger waving or a no approach, unless it's an egregious act or it's life threatening in the moment. But if it's a rules infraction, you can handle it one way, explain the rule. The next encounter may be a little bit more aggressive, but it's creating a culture where people kind of police themselves. And they pick up after themselves. They create that sense of ownership and pride in that place, that they're helping the staff do the job for them. Now, when you're dealing on, it's depending on scale. If you're dealing with hundreds of acres, thousands of acres, that's a very different proposition than if you're dealing with an urban park or a smaller festival space that can operate differently than, say, a national park. So I think that answer kind of depends on where it is and what the scale of the project is.
Yeah, I think there's also, I've worked on 25 central district plans. And so you're looking at a framework level quite often at that scale. And within that, each city has a culture and a history that gets embedded in those spaces. And so there's a cultural and physical memory as part of that. So everything we do, every generation is an additive layer and all that. So Joel Kotkin, who's a demographer, talks about cities as sacred, safe, and busy. And so, you think about the sacred places in a city, and maybe, well, I lived in Berkeley for 20 years, so People's Park was considered a sacred place, and then, and it wasn't the Stephensplatz or, in Austria or something, which is another type of sacred space. I worked with a Hopi tribe for a year, and their plazas in traditional villages, sacred places, sacred spaces, right? And so, and safe, and that's different because we used to fort up. And now we use social tools for safety. And so we've all heard about eyes on the street, neighborhoods, or eyes on the park, how we self-supervising social situations and communities, all that. And then the busy part, that's the programming piece of it. You have to keep it busy. So it's and the inclusiveness aspect to this is what makes space is most memorable and interesting. Because what's a stage without the actors? Right?
Absolutely. And I also think for what I do, it's helping communities realize what their authentic self is and helping bring that programming that reflects back the community to them, that says there is something here for me. I can come and experience something I enjoy, but I also might experience something I've never tried before. So for example, at the park in Dallas where I worked, we did a free opera simulcast once a year. And it introduced an art form to communities of people that may have never experienced that art form before. But in order to attract them to come to the park and give it a try, we set up activities and events in advance of the opera that were attractive to them, that they had done before, that gave them kind of a reason to connect the dots. And then you see communities having a shared experience that may have never had that shared experience before. So that intentional programming that reaches different ages, different demographics, different cultures, and lets one another experience the other, I think is really interesting and really what kind of lends to the vibrancy of a space.
You know, I think it'd be great if you gave us a couple of examples about how people are using some of your park spaces. Then the thing, because you're so close to it, you know, I'm often working on these frameworks. I've designed some parks and have been part of management districts and stuff, you know, to do that. But now I'm in my ivory tower, and working on things that are much more gritty, like air quality. And so, but because you're living it right now. So your recent design problems and how communities are using them before and during the pandemic, and who's there and what are they doing? And I always ask my students, so who's there and what are they doing? That'd be interesting.
That's the first thing you have to ask. You got to know your audience. Who is it that you're attracting organically? Who are you not attracting and why? Could that be something in the design that's precluding people from feeling welcome, that says this isn't my space, or this doesn't look like a space that I would want, I'm encouraged to be in? Or is it programming? There's just nothing here that appeals to me and my group. So a lot of times the design is there. You could maybe be able to go in and retrofit something or change something, open it up so that it feels more inclusive, or you schedule activities to draw constituents that you aren't attracting. For example, at Clyde Warren Park, we weren't seeing a lot of tweens. There was programming for early education, and there was programming for adults. And there was this gap that we weren't doing anything for, and they weren't necessarily coming to the park unless they were, forced to come with their younger siblings.
Or turn off the opera music.
Exactly. So we created programming. We were intentional about that. But until we studied our demographics, until we realized we had an entire age group that was missing, and that was not intentional. We wanted them to be there. We had designed things for them to do. They just didn't know it. And we also weren't communicating to them in their language. We weren't using social media in the ways that would attract and appeal to that audience. Mm-hmm. So I think not only is it the design and the scheduling of activities, the activation, but it's also, you got to tell somebody. You have to market these spaces. And you need word of mouth. You need users to amplify your voice. And so until we were getting that third-party validation that other kids felt comfortable, or social media influencers thought it was the coolest thing to do, that's when we started to see this ripple effect. And that little 5.2 acre park built over a freeway serves over 1 million people annually. Mm-hmm. And no one in Dallas ever expected a park to have such a profound impact on the community, because we just hadn't used parks in this way before. We had used them to go play softball or Little League baseball, or just, off the shelf recreational solution as a playground, but something that's well designed with intent to attract diverse audiences, something that is intentionally programmed and activated, became a game changer. And it had a ripple effect that they could feel in the economy. And the property values that were rising around the park. And we're fortunate that there was no displacement, because it was literally built out of thin air. It wasn't taking land raising property values for homes that were impacted negatively around it. That did not happen because that was just a different environment. We know in communities where that's could be problematic, and you want to be on the leading edge of that. You want to work with cities to create policy to try to mitigate that wherever possible. And I got off on a big tangent talking about that, but I think it's
Well, we let you go there because it was good. I think, the other part of it is that during the pandemic, you could go outside,
yes.
right? And so I live near a historic golf course in Houston in the east side, which is a Hispanic side of town, this old historic golf course. And all these people tried golf during the pandemic. And there's been days I picked up 20 golf balls in the neighborhood because there's a lot of hackers now. But so the commitment to the outdoors and the public open spaces have become very important for dining, for being able to gather, streets, we all know in our towns, the cities had given back on-street parking to the retailers for outdoor dining or outdoor merchandising. So one of those trends, I'll be very interested to see what happens when we start recovering from the pandemic, about what we've learned about the public realm and how we've pushed commerce and social activities into it in new ways. And I think that's going to be some really interesting case study about how cities have learned from this, and they've learned that maybe they didn't need all the parking.
I love that. And we learned in Dallas that you can walk. I mean, that sounds so silly to say, but we didn't walk. We didn't realize the value of the spaces between the places, and they matter. And these parklets that were created by abandoning on-street parking, or these parking lots that are turned into parklets because people need more outdoor space to get together. And the fact that we're taking nature and greenery up into their buildings in terms of rooftop plazas or decks, or even now we're seeing in architecture buildings that have windows that open, things that you would not have heard of before, and getting clean air into your mid-rise.
Craig, you're probably guilty of some of that.
What's that?
Craig's probably guilty of some of that.
Well, and for people who do what I do, that's encouraging, because all the things we've been talking about, the value of green space, the value of community gathering, whether it be indoor, outdoor plazas, that's become elevated in the conversation because of what we've seen in COVID. And developers are recognizing they can have ROI on green space, on a plaza, and it doesn't have to go vertical just to be valuable.
Yeah. We work with our students. I always remind them that an acre of land, acre open space is energy, hydrology, recreation, and real estate. So it's got four layers of services in it, and they have to leverage it every acre. They have to figure out how to fully leverage that. So this is, I think, one of the positive things is really that we've been forced outdoors.
Absolutely.
And we're thinking about cities and outdoor spaces. Apartments with a balcony paid a premium because you had private outdoor space, right? So we are re-engaging with cities in a very different way.
Which has
I'm just curious about, we don't know exactly where we're going to end up. So there's this sort of antsiness, when you start looking at some of the stuff's interesting, but the length of, the period of time that we're in this zone of indecision and mistrust and social upheaval, as well, our cultural clash that we have now, that will, I think, determine how lasting some of these changes are going to be. And I think that, how I have worked with cities on programming their central park spaces and working on management plans for districts, that they have all had to make adjustments during this period, and what lessons will be learned, and what are we losing from all that? And I think that's I don't think I'm ready to go to a beer festival. That the spaces I've helped reinvent in San Francisco and in Sacramento are packed. They were packed spaces, and how they function now, I think is different, and in the future how they function and who can attend, and just the diversity of activities that happens may be impacted. And so, and part of that is, what do we formalize from the informal in our cities? Because I meet other academics that talk about awkward spaces in cities. In Houston, we have like plenty of awkward space, poorly defined, in between, unloved, and with its own communities. They have their own informal encampments and all that. And you see a lot of that now in California because of the housing crisis there. And so that these informal spaces, what part of that, are we formalizing? And how does that become part of the larger system and experiences? Because that's the backwater divide culturally and class, right? And California's highly defined by whether or not you have a roof over your head. Otherwise, you join another kind of community. And it's informality, and how we are protecting and thinking differently about our formal program open spaces at the same time, because that's one of the big cultural divides right now, and the haves and the have-nots. And I'm very curious about that from a public policy standpoint. What cities are going to step into that and own it?
One thing that I noticed over the pandemic is a lot of our clients were working really hard to figure out how to monetize exterior space, right?
Mhm.
Because the distance requirements, all the things, and just the safety and comfort of people wanting to be outside. And this goes all the way, obviously, the restaurants and bars were doing it, but museums and libraries, other groups are trying to think about how can we use the outside space better than we used to. It used to be just an aesthetic thing, in a lot of buildings.
Or it was residual.
Yes,
The developer wanted
residual.
to use, and so the awkward residual parts end up being a mini park or some awkward out of the way plaza or sitting garden that's doesn't end up being at all central to the city experience and the trade-offs of that. So I've been working with El Monte, California, on the mixed use corridor strategy and development standards. And so I've been working with them about taking all that, what we usually that residual space, and aggregate it at intersections and at corners, change the setback requirements, shift the density so that the open space then gets aggregated and activated as part of the public realm. It's a city that largely post-war that doesn't have those types of traditional open spaces. So to really rethink the corridor about a more forward-facing set of open spaces and plazas that become part of that identity. And so that's a policy level piece of it. And if you can stand back and look at it in the aggregate in these corridors, I think it makes a big difference.
The other interesting thing for me is, I remember in architecture school, we used to call them the negative spaces, right? I mean, which is bad connotation. But frankly, they're the positive spaces. They're what makes the city feel like a city. And I was just wondering from you guys, these spaces, these urban places, the way we treat our streets, the way that we design that movement of people and the activities, how can that contribute to the economics of a city, the economic growth? Can they be catalyzing events or
Oh,
catalyzing places?
Tara has been building all sorts of evidence about that and her projects. And I know when I work at these, at a strategic level with communities, that the placemaking piece is critical, and then that even in the economic development model is changing now, because this notion about you're creating places and communities that attract talent, right? So we're not attracting businesses anymore. I think that's been, we've talked about that now for at least a decade, about how we look at cities.
Mhm.
And the pandemic again has blown that up further. If 40% of us don't go back to the office, 20%, 50%, you hear people throw these numbers around. That means our neighborhoods are different. That's why I have the students working on this semester. They're looking at 170 acres of largely parking field around the football stadium and the Astrodome. And we're asking that question about creating a neighborhood of places that is a work-live neighborhood instead of a live-work neighborhood. We're flipping that, and so we'll compare that to some other typologies. But that's part of how cities are reevaluating risk. Open space is an important part of that because it does provide, used to say, well, it's the lungs of the city, or the Central Park is the living room of the city. We used all these analogies. And now the open space system, how it's activated and how it facilitates creation of community, whether it's you're a temporary local or if you're full-time, right? That this is how you create that sense of belonging and identity. That's what the knowledge workforce is looking for, that the next generation with all those new skills that we want in our businesses, that's what they're looking for. And so the cities that are going to be most competitive are going to provide that kind of community life.
And I think too, the walkability, the connections that a city can provide. Craig, you asked about the throwaway spaces or the negative spaces, and I refer to them as the spaces between the places. What does that scale feel like? Are you designing at a human scale? That's something that we've seen successful communities do over the last several years, is think about what do your edges look like? What are your entry points into your district, your downtown? How does that feel once you're in there? Can you walk? Does the walk feel long? For us in a Texas environment, it's hot. Same thing as in Nevada, it's hot. We want shade, and that's
It's a dry heat, Nevada.
It's yes. They're very lucky in that regard. But I'm not going to get out and walk when it's 102 with humidity if I don't have shade that I know I can strategically follow.
Yeah,
all
that's
the way to my
the
destination.
there's the character environmental aspect to it, and plus the other eco services, particularly if you live in extreme weather zones like we do. So there's just a layering of a lot of benefits when we start to think about these multi-use, intentionally planned open space frameworks. And it's been, we've looked at detention systems as being the new open space armature for unplanned neighborhoods, right? So that's part of the Houston way. This year, we worked on a 143 acre landfill site, put in regional detention, housing for about 6,000 people, 1 million square feet of non-residential, and a regional park. And that detention is going to help 3,000 properties not get flooded, right? But the real estate piece, it helped carry the financing gap for that project. And also we modeled for Heat Island. So we by using the kind of strategies that Tara's talking about, we can make it comfortable 20 more days a year to be outside. That lowers the cooling load on the buildings. So, but it's an intentional act, right? As part of this. So Craig, the last panel I was on, you had the planning director.
Yeah.
And in Nevada and in Las Vegas, climate change starts to diminish your plant list, right? There's a survivability, aspect to that. And so being very intentional about shade and water in your climate has to be, a key driver.
Absolutely. And I think that ground floor experience too, what does that journey feel like as you're walking through the city or through the community? I talked about designing at the human scale. If you're walking in an urban environment, you're just faced with high rises and lobbies of buildings, but there's nothing activated at the ground floor. That's a very different experience than if there are things that pull you along your journey. I think that's incredible. And that to me appeals to that retention of talent. If they really can live, work, and play in that community, and they don't have to. For a long time in Dallas, you had to leave downtown to go to a grocery store. You had to leave. You could live downtown, you could work downtown, but you couldn't go to the grocery store or the dry cleaner, or there just weren't those retail services to support that urban life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think building streets that work, urban streets that work is become feasible for every community. And there are a lot of cities are now retrofitting what they have done. And so years ago in AIA National Convention, I put together a session, what were we thinking, fixing the 70s? And it was looking at how cities are retrofitting some late modernist nightmares, in terms of public realm impacts. And I think, and that's one of our challenges in Houston. We have an interesting skyline, but it's all underground tunnels that connect those buildings. And the streets are just an extension of freeway ramps and are empty and hot. Mm. And so in many respects, best parts of Houston are the neighborhoods and some of the informal areas and the industrial communities that are transitioning, and they are occupying a lot of these informal spaces, which are far more interesting. Our ice house tradition, where in the 20s you may have had after you worked at the rail yards all day long, you'd go down to the corner and drink long necks out of a ice in a horse trough, right? And now the next generation has just owned that and has just taken it to the next level. And so that we have whole blocks of industrial buildings that have been turned into, big examples of what it's like to socialize outside.
Well, I love the example of the American Mall being turned inside out, peeling back the big box stores from a mall. We've got several projects going on across the country where that very thing is happening, creating green space, creating community gathering places where a brick and mortar retail might have been, and turning that old dinosaur of a concept, a big giant mall, into smaller bite-sized pieces with green connective tissue that's indoor outdoor uses.
Right. I think that's and food. So food and beverage is another discussion item. Developers have now about how much they can include in a project. That ends up being a really important part of the program piece of it. And so the people over Tara's shoulders there are socializing, but a lot of them are chewing and drinking, right? So shopping. And shopping. So these are and so the pandemic has changed how we think about some of that. Some of the more tactile experiences you have in cities have been truncated. That sort of collective shock and fear of mingling aspect you're starting to see evidence of that. So Craig, ask us some questions to help us, because we've been free ranging.
All
so
right.
help us bring it all home.
I think Jason jumped on with a question from the audience. So let's do that one.
Jason, help us connect
questions.
All of our random thinking.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there, a lot to unpack. But I think this question does talk about a little bit. And it's addressed to Tara. And the question is, how much resistance do you get during the planning process from people in positions of power who disagree with ideas of equity and maybe can't see the greater benefits of what you're designing or advocating for? Have you run across that in the past? And how do you deal with that situation?
Well, I would say I haven't come across the fact that people are opposed to equity per se. And I certainly would never expect an elected official to say something like that, but a private developer might couch it in a different way whereas they don't see the value of the investment in the green, the plaza, the undeveloped land that could be designed into a community space. But believe it or not, COVID has helped with that more than anything, because the talent is demanding it. That's what they're hearing from their employees. If that's what they're seeing in successful real estate developments, is those that approach it like a campus environment or as a multi-function, multi-use environment as opposed to a solo use. Even the high-rise towers that we're working on in dense urban environments all are thinking about outdoor patio space, roof environments, gathering places at different levels and different scales, at the ground level, interior, up above. So I think for us in the public open space business, COVID has had a silver lining insofar as that people now understand what we've been saying all along. You all need outdoor space. You can do more if you provide more space, and you can generate revenue. Craig mentioned that earlier. Outdoor spaces don't have to be a suck on just an expense pit. They can also help you offset your operating costs. They can be a revenue driver if you have an entrepreneurial approach into what you will allow to take place in those spaces.
You're gonna get more rent. I mean, it really is
Bottom
and
line.
sophisticated developers know that the value comes from outside the property line or outside the unit. Those common amenities and placemaking features in a design, add value. So and to be competitive, as Tara's saying, the sophisticated developers are more than eager to provide it.
And I would say in terms of equity, it's in the approach of who is your audience? I said it earlier, who's your audience? Who do you have already? Who do you want to attract that you don't have? And then how do you make everyone feel welcome so that they do feel like it's a space that they can, like, oh, I really can come in there. It's okay for me to do this class. It's funny when we do activation, intentional curated calendars of events, we find that it takes usually, one or two passes by before someone feels comfortable actually doing it. They don't trust that it's free or that it's truly available to them. But if they see it's consistently in that space and they come to depend on it and they see other people that look like them doing it, they're more likely to give it a shot.
Yeah, and Tara, in a lot of these places, this, that there's some functions that just are just cut across cultures and social economic groups, so food, farmers markets, outdoor markets are everybody goes,
Yep.
right? You're going to see the Gucci's and the shopping carts, right? Everybody's going to be there for those types of programmed activities, and many times it's the unintended use of an open space is what makes it popular.
Mm-hmm.
Ask any skateboarder. Every new park, is another course for them, another challenge. I think when you take where we are now, and we push a lot of this forward. I'm trying to think of some ways how this starts to bundle. There's been a lot of lessons learned about how you program ground floor of buildings, in the space activity pace, space activity and path game, is that a lot of that has been few secrets out there. The magic is with the designer and the community. And so I'm sure many of the folks on your call today are in the design community or work with us. And so part of it, we're the magic makers in many respects with our communities about this. We're born to listen. And I think part of the fact that it takes a more interdisciplinary approach. When I work, I always have a landscape architect on my team. I always have an economist on my team when I work on these large-scale urban design projects. I have specialists. Sometimes there's just an arts and public places person on the team, if that's one of the priorities for the community. Historic preservation, housing experts. We pull together the teams as architects to bring the talent to the table, to see a future that doesn't exist and then provide directions on how to get there. I think that's what's really important about looking at the future. Our role, what TAR's doing, what we do as a profession is more important than ever in terms of how we're making adjustments on the fly now and how we come out the other side in some sort of new normal condition and optimize what we have available, because that's what we do.
We also have, I think, on this call, some people from municipalities. And so I want to flip that question a little bit. And I'm going to ask it in two parts, but I want you guys to both answer from your perspective. What is the city's role, the municipality, the policy side? What's their role in helping create these great urban places? And what's their role in creating places to help the residents and the people that visit those cities? Should the city be doing to do? Neither one of you guys can start on that one.
Okay, well, you blinked off there for a minute, but really place creation and management, in a public-private world, there's a management function. TAR probably works for management districts or business improvement districts. So there's that dimension, that sort of quasi private public, partnership model for management. But the creating part is investment. And I've worked with 94 mayors. They were not all universally brilliant urban design mayors, right? The really smart ones knew that they had to get urban designers on the project, right? And so that added a lot of support, for addressing these issues. That, and I talk about this in big cities like Houston. Houston spends $7 million. Our city budget, $7 million per square mile. Houston. It's over 20 million in Los Angeles. It's 38 million in Chicago, and it's 304 million in New York City. 304 million, 7 million. So where's the commitment to the public realm and that kind of investment, right? So the intensity, you can say, well, Houston's, 3,400 people per square mile instead of 26,000 per square mile. So there's a density multiplier on that. But the point is, people get on airplanes and they'll fly to New York to see the public open spaces and enjoy the parks, right? So and so the policy commitment and working with community and their values. Some cities believe in a privatized public realm, and others are committed to a fully public control and ownership model. And when it comes down to the equity and who can use the space, that says something too.
I would add that in my experience, the cities that are doing it really well are solutions oriented. They kind of have that entrepreneurial mindset where they're willing to consider thinking outside the box when new ideas are brought to them. And their policy is leading with opportunities, but we also recognize that there's just more than every municipal employee can say grace over. That is just a job that has no end in sight, and they're doing the Lord's work, so to speak, and just making sure they're keeping the lights on.
And
But
also go ahead,
No,
go ahead and
please.
finish. I was gonna pile on that, because the other part, you got me all, enthusiastic there. So part of it is wanting to know more and do more as a policymaker or as a department lead, right? And so I used to put city councils on buses and go drive a corridor of connected cities to look at housing districts. Or the Chamber of Commerce in a couple cities I worked with help fund flying the city council to different cities to look at new sports facilities or new downtown plan results, right? So the interest in learning and growing and building on past investments and memories, but always leaning forward and looking for ways to be a better city with more pride and having the kind of enhancements and support that make you more competitive.
well said.
One thing that maybe I get you guys to address a little bit, and Tara, I know you can give us some specific examples, but the cities that also create these great places create an economic condition where other people want to come in and build, and that property values grow and the city tax base grows. So it is a win-win for everybody, including the policymakers, if they do this right. Can you talk a little bit about that, Tara?
Sure, I'll give you one example that I know really, really well, and that's in Dallas. Clyde Warren Park is a public-private partnership, and it was an idea that originated from the private sector, brought to the city of Dallas. I think when the city manager first heard the idea, she thought the city leaders or the civic leaders that were bringing it to her were just not right in the head, because that just, how do you build a park out of thin air? How do you put it over freeway? Clearly other communities around the country had already done it. We just didn't realize that in Dallas. But the mayor at the time said, if you can show me the private sector's willingness to invest in this, we'll take it seriously. You got 6 weeks. If you can raise $10 million, we'll put you on a bond. And they did it. And that private sector got the commitments of $10 million. And ultimately the bond passed. So there's 20 million in a bond. There was 20 million in TxDOT money and 17 million in federal stimulus money that came after the project was going. So it is a city-owned park that's privately managed. When construction on that park began in 2009, it opened in 2012. Land was selling at $80 a square foot in 2009. And in 2014, the last parcel that was adjacent to the park sold for almost $400 a square foot, and now it's close to $600. So the incremental impact of that has been tremendous. About $2.5 billion in development. New buildings have gone on around the park. There is a public improvement district that helps fund it. It's 2.5 cents per $100 of property value. And when I left the park, that PID had been in place for about 2 years, and it was putting off a little over $1 million annually to help support the operations of the park and support the Dallas Arts District. And it was an overlay of 2 other existing public improvement districts. So there was an uptown PID and a downtown PID that already exists. So the Park Arts District one went on top of that one. So the property owners they recognized the value of this open space and keeping it maintained and managed well and secured, and were willing to invest twice into 2 public improvement districts, which I thought was significant that they were willing to do that as property owners. And then, for example, the town of Cary, North Carolina, we're doing a large park there. The town is completely funding the entire park. The town is funding all operations and maintenance. It's going to be a highly active park. They're taking an entrepreneurial approach to managing this new park. They're creating a new staffing model to manage this new park in downtown Cary because they recognize the value of retaining and recruiting talent to the businesses that are in and around Cary, North Carolina. And they know that this asset will be a regional draw. So they're investing in the town to keep economic development sparked and talent and recruitment high for their community.
It's just amazing.
I could give you many more examples, but I thought those were two good. One's a public-private partnership and one is 100% public, but yet they're both doing it for very similar reasons.
All right, well, I got time for one more question. So we talked about inclusion and equity, right? We talked about creating places. We've talked about the economics. One thing we haven't talked about is, what about climate change? How does that affect the next generation of design we're doing? And what can we here in an arid environment, what can we do best in our city? And I'm just going to fire off in quick answers on this one.
Okay, well, we talked about the cool streets and buildings a bit, right? And the heat island aspect for this, but where's your prevailing breezes? I'm famous for studio juries looking at students and doing this. Which way south, right? And so partly being realistic about where we are in terms of climate and the kind of sites we have to work in is important. And obviously, if you look at passive strategies in open space, even at a city scale, you look at other cultures, they will use open space as a breeze scoop. They'll funnel breezes. They'll design buildings that they're higher performance, as they connect open space in the shoulder seasons. And so there's these other sort of tactical aspects for it, but the public will, to think about not using the same civil engineering manual that we all used because it worked in Sunnyvale, California in 1968, because there's a lot of cities with that civil code. And so I think part of it is making room. COVID has given us some time to experiment. It has forced us to. Climate change is going to force us to experiment. So the innovation part of it, and I love to work with Tara on a project where we're looking at a district, and we're considering the role of open space in microclimate and in terms of comfort, and then think about the programming from that perspective, and how that interacts with the buildings and the passive strategy in the building. So these district scale passive strategies, we know that's at the bottom of the pyramid. Those passive strategies, and we have active design, and technology sits on top of that. And if you put the building in the wrong spot, there's not enough design or technology you can put in it to make up for it, right? So that's where cities have a chance to retrofit and rethink their new districts to be ready. And there's a big resilience layer in that. So Tara, in Houston, all of our open spaces have to be really part of flood control. We commit, for every acre of land we develop, we need over an acre foot of detention in Houston. It's a crazy amount of space that every project gives back to detention. And rather than digging a hole and putting a fence around it because the attorney told you to, it's a design opportunity.
Yep. That's exactly what I was going to say is commit to infrastructure as an amenity. What can you do to make it a designed element, a rain garden? We worked in Houston near Memorial City, and turned Conrad Sauer Detention Basin into it's an amenity. It's a green space. It's designed to flood and recover, but when it's not full of water, it's a great space to walk through. So instead of turning your back on that culvert, that ditch, whatever it may be, embrace it, make it an amenity that can help improve the community.
I think on that, I'm going to end this. That was perfect. This was so fun. Thank you both for all your time and your expertise. And I know everybody that attended today came away more enlightened. And we really appreciate it. And you guys have a great night. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Craig. It was fun. See
Thank
everybody
you.
later.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye.
All right. Bye.